Hey guys, I got another story for you. This one's called Don't Squeal Unless It's a Big Deal. A Tale of Tattletales by Jeannie Franz Ransom and illustrated by Jackie Urbanovic. Here we go. Ooh! There were 19 students in Mrs. McNeil's class and 19 tattletales. It all started when Jessica trotted up to Mrs. McNeil's desk. Here she goes.
Peter pulled my pigtail.
Well, that must have hurt, said Mrs. McNeil. Did you tell Peter that? Jessica nodded. Mrs. McNeil said, Let's see what Peter has to say. Peter dragged his hooves all the way up to Mrs. McNeil's desk. Jessica says you pulled her pigtail, Mrs. McNeil said. I did not, said Peter.
Yes, you did,
Jessica said. Both of you have the right to say how you feel, Mrs. McNeil said. You have the right to feel safe and comfortable at school. Rules like to keep your hooves to yourself make it easier to do that. Mrs. McNeil added, but since Jessica's tail is still attached and Peter doesn't look particularly dangerous at the moment, I think it's safe to go back to your desks now. Jessica stomped. Peter snorted. Mrs. McNeil started humming, The Farmer in the Dell. Mrs. McNeil had just lifted up her cup of slop for a quick slurp when Stephen trotted up. Rachel took my pink marker and she won't give it back. I even asked her 2 times. Mrs. McNeil put down her cup. Stephen, I'm so glad you tried to fix the problem yourself. First by talking with Rachel, she said. Maybe her ears aren't working well today. Stephen can't find his pink marker, Mrs. McNeil said. Have you seen it? I gave it back, Rachel cried. I can't find my pink marker. That's because you used it all up, Peter said. You're always drawing pictures of pigs. Rachel sniffed. For your information, those pictures are of moi. What am I supposed to do? Color myself green? You know our class rule, Rachel, said Mrs. McNeil. If you want to borrow something, ask first. It's how friends treat friends and stay friends. Mrs. McNeil just had taken her first slop when Mrs. Megan announced, Frankie called Sookie fat so. Mrs. McNeil had to gulp her slop before she could speak. She cleared her throat and hoped she didn't have a corn kernel in her teeth. I'm glad you know the rules so well, Mrs. McNeil said. You're right. We don't call each other names. Also, we don't try to fix problems that don't belong to us, Mrs. McNeil said. I know you're trying to help, but if Frankie and Sookie have a problem, it's their job to fix it, and if they can't, it's my job as the teacher to help them. Your job, Mrs. McNeil added, is to take care of you. That's the most important job you can have. Megan danced a little jig all the way back to her desk. But then the stampede started. Rob breathed on me. Johnny ripped my paper. Emily called my desk a pigsty. Jeremy's a grunter and I can't concentrate. Laura looked at me. Sam's picking his snout. Students had practically worn a path to Mrs. McNeil's desk and worn out her patience. When she stood up, the students sat down. Before we go to lunch, I think we need to add a new rule to our list, Mrs. McNeil said. A very important rule. She added, can anyone tell me what squealing is? Students started squealing like their tails were stuck in a gate. Not that kind of squealing, Mrs. McNeil shouted, waving a cowbell. When the class was quiet, Mrs. McNeil continued. Squealing, she said, is my very special word for tattling. And I know you know what that is. New class rule. Some students looked at the door, at the floor. Some looked at each other. And some looked at the ceiling like they'd suddenly seen something interesting up there. Mrs. McNeil started writing on the board. Here's our new class rule, said Mrs. McNeil. What does it mean? Jessica asked. I'm glad you asked, Jessica, Mrs. McNeil said. To squeal on someone means you go tell a grown-up when someone does something or says something that you don't like, instead of telling on that person first. Or telling that person first. Most problems then that happen between kids are kid-sized problems that they can work out themselves, Mrs. McNeil said, usually by talking, listening, and helping each other. But sometimes, Mrs. McNeil said, something happens that's bigger than a kid-sized problem, like when someone is hurt or in danger, or when someone or a person is hurting you or hurting a pet, or hurting something that doesn't belong to them, something that belongs to all of us. That's when it's okay to squeal, because it's a big deal, and when it's a big deal, it's an emergency. That's when you need to hoof it and get up and get help from a grown-up. Oscar raised his hoof. I know it's not a big deal, Mrs. McNeil, but I'm hungry enough to eat a haystack. Mrs. McNeil laughed. Me too. I'm sure we'll get to practice what we've learned when we get back. But that afternoon, Mrs. McNeil had barely closed the classroom gate when Katie said, Jenny hog the rope swing at recess? And Mrs. McNeil pointed to the board. Remember what we just learned. Katie nodded. Then, you need to tell Jenny first about the problem. Tell me what? Jenny yelled from across the room. That you were hogging the swing, Katie yelled back. You never asked for a turn, Jenny said. I didn't get a turn, Jeremy said. It's not my fault, Peter said. It's not this time. It's Carolyn's fault, Sookie said. Who's Carolyn? Oscar asked. She's not even in our class, Frankie said. Thump! Mrs. McNeil had disappeared. Are you okay? Megan asked. Mrs. McNeil didn't answer. Her eyes were closed, her tail was limp, and one ear had something red on it. Quick, call the office. Tell them it's an emergency. Somebody get the nurse. Somebody tell Mrs. Hamlin next door. Later that afternoon, the students visited Mrs. McNeil in the nurse's office. We're sorry we squealed so much today, Jessica said. We didn't mean to make you mad, Peter said. It's our fault, Katie cried. It wasn't anybody's fault, Mrs. McNeil said. It was an accident. I slipped on some spilled slop. It must have been quite a mess. We thought you had exploded, Jeremy said. Oh, it was pretty gross, Oscar added. Maybe you'd better not eat that stuff anymore, Rachel said. So you need to take care of yourself. It sounds like all of you took care of the problem, Mrs. McNeil said. Everyone says you knew just what to do when I got hurt. Only because you're such a good teacher, Jessica said. And you're such good learners, Mrs. McNeil said. We still need some practice, Katie said. We all do. When we learn something new, Mrs. McNeil said. So let's practice. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal. The end.